You're listening to Make Planning Make Sense. I'm Aaron Zimmerman, and I'm a director at Centro Planning Consultancy.
And I'm Alex Roth, a planner at Centro. Welcome back to another episode.
Today, we are very honored to be speaking with Peter Murray OBE. Peter makes a strong case for a design vision, senior leadership, and continuity in the local authority. We talked about Peter's insights from his time on the board of directors of Be First, an organization established by the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham that arguably revived the practice of public design vision. The word that stood out to me was attitude, and the way that attitude comes from the top. At Centro, we're able to achieve results even when a public design vision is lacking. But Alex and I also know from experience how public design leadership can really stabilize the planning process and improve delivery.
Yeah, Aaron, it's one thing to set a bold spatial vision, but do you have a process in place to deliver that vision? Peter refers to the work of overseeing a vision, and he cites the example of King's Cross. I notice this especially on schemes that we work on, which are of particular strategic importance. Is the local authority aligned even amongst its own officers on how to deliver these visions? And I think a big part of our job is navigating that and, where necessary, helping to translate that vision into reality.
I couldn't agree more, and I am so excited to share this conversation with you. Remember to check out our brand new social pages on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. Our handle is MPMS Podcast on all platforms. We look forward to continuing the conversation with everyone there. Here is our conversation with Peter Murray. Peter Murray OBE, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Peter is the co-founder of New London Architecture, an independent forum for the discussion of issues related to physical change and the built environment in London. He's also the founder of the London Festival of Architecture, and Peter has recently been awarded the Linus Beadle Lifetime Achievement Award by the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. Congratulations on that, Peter.
Thank you very much.
I think if we spent the due amount of time on your CV, then we would run out of time on the air. So listeners, you can learn all about Peter and his work at the NLA website. And I'm also happy to say that you are our first guest with a Wikipedia page. So I'm really pleased to have you on here. But, if we can start by setting the scene and your aspiration for a vision-led approach in planning in general, in development as an industry, and the forthcoming London plan.
The forthcoming London plan and the devolution bill as well, because we are in a very interesting time. The mayoral combined authorities will have to produce structure plans as well. And as you say, the London plan is being produced right at the moment. So one has to look back and think, what are structure plans about? And they do have to be about a vision, they have objectives, and they have priorities. Dealing with those things which are easily dealt with in numbers is something which happens very easily in that you define how many homes you need, what sort of jobs you're going to have to deliver, what scale the economy is going to be, those numbers. But
how deep the balcony needs to be.
All
the width of a single bedroom. Yeah.
But I think that what at the moment we are rather missing, I feel we're missing it in the discussions around the London plan, is that idea of a vision. And I look back to the beginnings of the London plan with Lord Richard Rogers and Ken Livingstone. I actually organised an exhibition at the Royal Academy back in 1986 where Richard Rogers showed his plans for the pedestrianising of Trafalgar Square, a project which Norman Foster actually then delivered a few years later, also creating a park along the Victoria Embankment. Looking at his thinking over the years, that developed into ideas around placemaking in the city, but also the idea of the compact city, a city that doesn't sprawl, that had high density development around areas of good public transport. Mm-hmm. And that was fed into the urban task force ideas, but also then focused into London on the first London plan. And the basis of that plan actually is still working today. The idea that actually all development for London takes place within the area of the Greater London Authority. And you have these areas of density with taller buildings. And I think it is very interesting when you go into the NLA model in the London Centre and you can see what has happened over the last 25 years, which are these pockets, taller areas, that show where densification has taken place.
Yeah.
And somebody like Simon Jenkins, who's always having a go against tall buildings, says, London is a low-rise city. Well, if you actually look at our model of London, it still is a low-rise city, but you have these pockets of higher density, which is what we need to have if we're going to provide housing and services for our population. We need them.
It is overwhelmingly a city of 2-story or 2-story plus roof terraces, isn't it? And the NLA model, if anybody hasn't seen it yet, it is fantastic. You can get it from the model. But what I love about being in London with some kind of vantage point is it really is a multipolar city in terms of its densities. And I think that that's something with opportunity areas that have really begun to take off, especially as housing became more of a priority in the Zone 2, Zone 3 sort of areas, Stratford, Ealing, that kind of thing. Is there opportunity to continue that, to keep expanding that?
Well, when we started NLA in 2005, we did an exhibition called The Changing Face of London. And that had all those opportunity areas, which at that stage were generally computer-generated images of new developments. And then 20 years later, we did another exhibition called The Changing Face of London, and a large number of those opportunity areas had been built. Stratford, White City, Old Oak Common hasn't gone very far, but Nine Elms was done remarkably quickly, actually, very speedily. And that change has happened, and we need to have a different view of what the city needs to be for the next 20 years, and that's where the vision comes in. And I'm a great believer in having a city architect, as Richard Rogers was. He never called himself city architect, and it wasn't a full-time job. With the RIBA, who obviously they like the idea of city architects generally, but in the current situation where there are going to be a lot of new strategic plans coming forward, to have architects involved in the vision for those. And I've looked at city architects around the world, a lot of city architects, particularly in Europe, and they do provide something very special to the city, which without that sort of accent on design, and it's not just about designing individual buildings, it is about a vision for what a city should be like.
The term New London vernacular comes to mind, and this architectural style, if we can call it that, has emerged out of the out of the guidance that's come forward.
Well, I think you have to define what your vision is, and to a certain extent, Richard Rogers, if you look at the cross-sections of the plans in his book, Cities for a Small Planet, and a lot of the focus was around sustainability, and I think that you have to look at that vision, and clearly that there are whole areas of London which are just 2-story, low density, needs a bit of densification, but that is really hard. Croydon had a very good programme for densifying their suburban areas. It created a lot of political antagonism. They got a new Conservative mayor who had a ticket to stop densification, and when he got in, their plan stopped overnight. Yet, while they were delivering that densification, they were delivering more small site projects, way more small site projects than any other London borough. So it worked very well, but it created a lot of antagonism to suburban occupiers. So I think that we need those areas of centres around public transport which are taller and denser, and then gentle density can sort of move from that. And there are now a lot of examples of gentle density utilising, you say, New London vernacular that I think work. Brent Cross Town, Kidbrooke Village, a whole series of really quite successful projects which do that. And I have to say, you laughed a bit about New London vernacular, but I think that it may be the best thing that Boris Johnson is remembered for in years to come, because it really evolved from the Mayor of London's Housing Design Guide, which came out during his mayoralty. And it has developed a style of architecture which is all brick. And I have to say, actually, brick is a very sustainable material in terms of maintenance. Maybe it costs a bit to bake the bricks in terms of CO2 emissions, but actually in terms of maintaining it, and after 500 years, it still looks good. So as that depth of windows, proportions, front doors, all sorts of things like that, which I think work very well in the London context. As an approach, it means that maybe we don't get the most spectacular, innovative architecture, but it certainly does control the worst. It provides a good median design. And to a certain extent, if you look back at the Georgian city, it was very simple, very basic, but worked very well.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing and what I would absolutely agree with is the fact that the New London vernacular, if we're calling it that now, it's not our term, but it's not offensive. And one of the things we've talked about with other guests is that not each piece of architecture in a city needs to be a striking, sweeping statement. Sometimes you really want it to, avoid the worst and get it up on its feet in a way that isn't going to be difficult to sort through with each new design-led process.
Yes, I remember going to a debate at the RABA, and people were mainly talking about some of the big city developments in the Middle East and Dubai with all its towers. And somebody said, well, to get the right sort of balance in the city, you've got to think of porridge with currants in it. Mm-hmm. And if you just have a few currants well spaced across, it's good. But if you have it covered in currants, it's too much. And I think that cities are a bit like that.
I grew up in Dubai. I think I know what you mean.
Lots of currants.
I love dried fruit, but...
Listeners, how do you feel about currants or Team Sultana?
Yeah. I love a dried fig.
Yeah, but an orchard of figs is...
In moderation, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So speaking of the vision-led approach, with the new London vernacular, right, there's a move to sort of define a visual identity and design standards for the city more broadly, and there's vision there on quality of accommodation, and we have a good deal of vision setting set out in our planning policy in London. Where do you think there is still work to do on defining vision?
Well, I like to look in terms of how you oversee a vision and what proper master planning can do. And I look at 4 different parts of London. If you compare, for instance, Canary Wharf and the Isle of Dogs, or you compare King's Cross and Nine Elms, and you look at the final sort of outcomes of them, you can go to King's Cross, and I think it's generally thought that that's probably the best bit of urban regeneration, certainly anywhere in Europe and maybe in the world. And I think that certainly the master planning is about the big picture, but it is also about detail. It's about corners, it's about routes, it's just about the space you create for people in front of the granary, that sort of thing. And so there is a lot of manoeuvring at the edges, you might say, of different parts of the development. Let's now go to Nine Elms. And the same sorts of people are occupied in those, but it has about 27 different developers. And there was also quite a lot of argument at the time about numbers of homes and so on, because things kept changing around the funding and how are they going to pay for the Northern Line extension. So some buildings got bigger. There was a lot of arguing about the size of the park that would go through the middle. And that park, you see, had been put in by a planning framework, which the GLA had delivered in 2009. And on its own, I thought, well, this is a really good basis to start from. But when you start nibbling away at the edges, you start losing that quality. And I would say it's more extreme when you get to Canary Wharf and the Isle of Dogs, because there, on the Isle of Dogs, there was no real master plan, and Tower Hamlets were giving permissions for 70-storey towers to one developer, and then somebody else wants one as well, and somebody else says, well, if they've got one, why can't I have one? And then Tower Hamlets suddenly realised, well, what's going to happen at the ground? Where are we going to, if we've got people living in these with children, where are they going to play? Where's the open space? Whereas in Canary Wharf, and I think Wood Wharf is actually hugely preferable as a plan to the more orthogonal Manhattan-style Phase 1 in terms of planning. There is a real placemaking going on there. And I think that, again, like King's Cross, actually works as a good overall plan, but also very good at detail, the placemaking and the interaction of people, place, movement, landscaping, and the architecture.
Are there specific elements of King's Cross that you find particularly successful in terms of placemaking?
Well, I think Granary Square is one of the great meeting points of London now, and that's happened in a very short space of time. I would say that there are some aspects of it which they've struggled with, and a long time ago I was actually working with Foster and Partners on their scheme for King's Cross, which was, I can remember going to a meeting must have been about 1988, something like that, that said the first phase of the King's Cross development will be delivered Q4 1993. And that didn't happen. But certainly there was always this issue, how do you move people from the stations up to the retail over the canal?
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. I mean, you do feel quite drawn in from the corner of King's Cross, right?
Yeah,
it really draws you up, doesn't it?
These are these spaces that people might go to on a Sunday afternoon once they can't think of anything else to do. And I mean that in the best way, because if you don't have any specific objective and you just want to be in a nice place and enjoy your environment, that's a really strong sort of indication of the confidence of that success. Alex, to your point as well, when I do go to Granary Square and I leave the tube at King's Cross, St. Pancras, in my mind's eye, it's always right around the corner. And you actually walk a bit, so I understand the design challenge of trying to draw people up there, because it feels like it's at the doorstep, but you're actually walking probably 300-400 meters, I guess.
Yeah. But I think one also has to take into account the serendipity of them actually having an art school right in the centre of it, because that wasn't a part of the original plan. But Central St. Martin's came along, were looking for a building, and they say, oh yeah, well, that's a good building for them.
Yeah.
But what they then soon realised was that even when you've hardly got any bit of the rest of the development done, you have people walking up there on that route on a regular basis, lots of young people who then occupy the cafes and kick the whole thing off. And so now everybody wants a university as a sort of seed bed for their development.
Yeah. Master architect or master plan architect. What's the term? Sorry.
City architect?
Well, you can call them all sorts of things, actually. I mean, I like city architect because when I started training as an architect, actually half the profession was in the public sector, and there were city architects in almost every city. So I think it's an easy term to use, but in German and Dutch cities, they have Baumeister, master builder, actually has a very good, might say, English resonance too. So I wouldn't mind that. And when I had early discussions about that with the Office of Place and Michael Gove, people like that, there were whole discussions around that they would be chief placemaker, something like that. But I find placemaking is good if you're looking at city spaces, but it seems to have been taken over as a word that means planning, actually.
Plus continuity. Planning plus a horizon longer than the speculative development model or longer than the next council election. What I'm really hearing is the continuity, but then also the singular vision, that there's sort of one node that is controlling design conversations, which otherwise unbridled can really go on forever.
Yes. Well, I think that is always a problem, isn't it, is relating political thinking to the time it takes to deliver stuff, particularly infrastructure, but also now the larger developments, housing developments. Barclay Home has been working on Southall for about 18, 20 years to do that, and there are big chunks of Docklands that have been empty and try to get going even longer than that. So you do need something which provides that continuity without continual change, and I think that vision is really important to do that.
In your view, what would you see as opportunities for the GLA for the next London plan?
I was very interested in sitting on a platform the other day with Peter Rees, who was the chief planner in the City of London for a number of years and was probably the nearest person to a city architect who we've had in the last 20 years or so. And he said he'd been looking at the current makeup of the Corporation of London's planning team, and he said that his design role was 3 tiers lower than it was when he was there. So I thought, well, I'll have a look on the GLA's website, and their sort of senior designers are at tier 12, something like that. The senior level is 15, so they're 3 down from the senior level. And then you've got a deputy mayor for planning on top of that as well. So it's certainly a very different level than it was when the Architecture and Urbanism Unit, which included Richard Rogers, was operating under Ken Livingstone. So I think that actually, whatever you call them, those architects should be jacked up to the top tier.
How do you think that's manifested in design in the built environment since then? Maybe the lack of design being high up on the agenda.
I'd say that vision of design, which came from a lot of thinking that Richard Rogers had, and also the influence of people like Jan Gehl in Copenhagen, who's been to London quite a few times and advised different groups. He is often quite depressed about London because we don't take his placemaking views on board in quite the same enthusiasm as maybe cities like Melbourne or even New York. He has influenced parts of London, and the Grosvenor Estate, for instance, took his advice on a number of retail street improvements that they had. So I would say that the seeds which Richard Rogers sowed, as I say, way back to 1986 in the Royal Academy exhibition, it's taken 40 years for some of those to actually happen. And even here, and we are in an office overlooking St John Street, this is where we held the first architecture biennale, which it was initially called the Clerkenwell Architecture Biennale. But CABE told us that was too local for them to give us any money, so we changed the name to the London Architecture Biennale, and then it became the festival when we realised that we ought to do it every year rather than every 2 years. But anyway, what we did on the first event was to grass over the street out here with real turf, and it became a park for the weekend, and something like 15,000 people came here and were sitting out having picnics. People coming out of fabric at 4 o'clock in the morning were just lying, looking at the dawn as it came up over Smithfield Market. And the idea of doing that was to prompt Islington Council to think, well, actually, this is a wide street, and it's a wide street for historical reasons, because it was where all the cows came down. There was Higgs Hall, which was in the middle of that wider space. Draw attention to that and say to Islington, this could be much better than a rather grotty 4-lane road, which it is at the moment. And I see they're digging it up, and I hope that digging up is the start of their programme, because somebody from LDA Design actually did put something on LinkedIn saying, Peter Murray, watch this space, something's happening in St John Street. So I hope that's what it is.
I love this. This is such sort of like an origin story for what they are doing, which is exactly that. So I don't think it's as much park as it is much higher quality surfaces and a lot of street architecture around that. As a business here in Clerkenwell, if you know, you know, we got a consultation letter, and being who I am, I was like, yes, I'm filling out this consultation because my lived experience of that road is exactly as you described. And the vehicles just think, for this 100 meters, I am going to go 40 miles an hour.
That's right.
What a joy.
That's right.
Here's my little pick-me-up this morning. So when they fenced it all off, and I was connecting the dots, I thought, that's great. And now we're talking about its inception, really.
But that was a change which seemed like a good idea 20 years ago, and then it takes time for politicians to get round to it, people to push it, people then to design it and deliver it. And I would say that also Terry Farrell took over really from Richard Rogers when Boris became mayor. And Terry Farrell was also somebody who thought very deeply about planning in London and the vision for London. And actually, without Terry Farrell, Old Oak Common would not have happened at all, really. It was he who saw that as a place for development where you had High Speed 2 and Crossrail coming together in that area.
So am I understanding you correctly then that if we lose that vision today, we might not see it immediately, right? But we're going to risk not reaping what we sow in 20 years or so if we start to lose some of that vision now, right?
Yeah, you need that debate and discussion to a certain extent. I mean, that's what New London Architecture is about. And the Festival of Architecture is really once a year. But, during the rest of the year, New London Architecture continues that debate, as do other organisations in London. I mean, we are very lucky compared to many other cities of having various organisations, whether it's Open House or the Architecture Foundation, who actually create a real good basis for discussion about the shape of cities and the design of cities. I mean, this does come out of our planning system, really, and our legal system, the fact that planning system is based on common law. So everything is really an argument, isn't it? I mean,
yup.
So if people are arguing all the time, it does create a very rich debate. And I know we'd all like things to happen rather more speedily sometimes without too much faffing around. But actually what that situation has created a very rich culture of architectural discussion in Britain, which doesn't happen in many other cities.
We will be right back. Speaking of this culture of discussion, you founded the NLA, 30,000 plus members, I believe. Centro became a member recently, and we're really pleased to join the organization. Can you tell us a little bit about the vision that you had for the NLA and then what the NLA has been able to enact and enable in its operation?
Well, it's evolved a lot, really, over the 20 years or so it's been going. We were looking at doing something which was like the Pavillon d'Arsenal in Paris. The Pavillon d'Arsenal was created while they were delivering their Grand Projet back in the 1980s, and it was to show the citizens of Paris what the president was planning to do. But it became a real place where people would come and find out what was happening in the city. There were temporary exhibitions about the city. And so we coordinated with the building centre, and that in itself was very interesting in that, although we called it New London Architecture, it attracted a much broader audience than just architects. Now, really, the membership covers the sort of whole of the built environment sector. And again, I think because of that level of debate and discussion which goes on, we have created a more powerful network than other comparable cities. Whereas here, we have this sort of broad network which comes together and covers everything from developers to politicians, and they all become members. So even the mayor is a member.
And the building centre, very cool space. Really great to just go get a coffee, which is cool.
That worked very well for us for, I suppose, 18 years, well, until COVID. We then upsticked and moved to the Guildhall in the city, which is a very different location in that you might say it's more political in terms of the way that we connect with the city, but it's a very, very nice space. And as a part of the sort of development of what NLA does, we've now expanded the work we did on Opportunity London, which was originally some publications we did which really looked at what different boroughs were doing. And that has now really transformed into a way of connecting boroughs to inward investors. And so it's actually very active collaboration between NLA and London and Partners and the Mayor in terms of how we sell London to investors.
I mean, Peter, to your point about, it not just being focused on architects, NLA generally, I mean, realizing that this is broader than just architects, I think architecture is such a good way in for a lot of people to join the conversation and something that people can get excited about. Just seeing a model is a great way in, right? To start having these conversations, and then that leads into all these other related elements of the built environment. I think that is especially important when we really need to get people engaged and excited about engaging in policymaking at the strategic level as well, and not just when it's related to something in their neighborhood.
Well, I think that actually models are really just fascinating in the way that people relate to them. Because obviously we talk a lot now about digitization of planning, the mechanism of planning, but also how you explain plans to people. And clearly all sorts of things of, put on 3D virtual reality masks and all that sort of stuff and see what's happening. And we've had for a long time screens showing what is happening in places. But people look at computer images and screens for literally 20, 30 seconds, just like they do on a computer screen, and bored with that. They turn around and come to the physical model, and literally people will spend hours looking at it, studying it, telling us if we missed something out. And there is a fascination with models.
Now I just want to spend a good hour talking about the model, to be honest. How do you?
Yeah, okay. Well, where do we start then?
No, I'll have to forgive myself that temptation. Well, we can.
The shard used to get taken off the model quite frequently, had to be replaced.
So do you have like a little drawer of shards that you can just...
Well, very luckily, one of our successes is that the co-founding of NLA was myself and Nick McKeough of Pipers, the model makers, and so that relationship has been absolutely fundamental to delivering.
No, that sounds so cool. I wonder, the shard reference made me wonder whether there is a relationship between the model and that concept of wayfinding and orientation.
Well, I would say it's essential for visitors to London to come and look at the model to understand, first of all, that the river isn't straight and it actually turns around 90 degrees or even more. It always fascinates me if I'm cycling up, let's say, from Battersea to the city. The changing relationship of St Paul's Dome and the Shard really shows you how big a loop that river is as you go round. And without those, actually, I think it would make visitors understanding the city much more difficult. So if they come to the NNA, they can see that very serpentine image of the Thames and how it relates to all the other buildings that they're going to come and have a look at. So, we want people to go to the London Centre before they go to do anything else in London, really. And although tourists don't do that, a lot of parties who come from other cities to study what's going on in London will begin their journey in NLA, and that gives them a really good grounding for where they want to go and where they want to look at.
Our people.
Really. We need to do a brief aside about cycling, because I read that you, in 2006, you cycled from London to Cannes to MIPIM.
And you cycled to our office today.
Yes. Well, I do cycle quite a lot. And the cycle to Cannes, which started off 2006, so next year is the 20th anniversary. Now, over that whole period, we've raised about £6.5–7 million for various charitable causes, largely Coram, around the corner here. So that was important both to get to an event which was about the built environment, also suggesting that there are different ways of going to events like that than flying. But I would say almost as important was then about a dozen of us cycle across America in 2013 to study what different American cities were doing to accommodate cycling. We started in Portland, Oregon, which then was the sort of capital for cycling in America. Very polite motorists and cyclists, and then a place like Minneapolis and Philadelphia all had good stuff. And as I was saying earlier, New York had really delivered large-scale infrastructure for cycling under the Transit Commissioner, Jeanette Siddiq-Khan, no relation.
Yeah.
So that was very impressive. And for me, one of the greatest aspects of it was that when we came back, we wrote a report which went into City Hall. And just one of the things we found was not to do with infrastructure at all, but was actually one of almost courtesy, which we found in a lot of areas of the States. We found a sign en route which showed a hierarchy of, it was actually skateboarders and cyclists and motorists. And we thought, So we came up with a little signpost, triangular one, which was basically said that cyclists give way to pedestrians and motorists give way to cyclists. So it's a sort of circularity to it. And then the guy who wrote the new highway code put in a tweet that talked about the hierarchy of road users, which is a key part of the new highway code. And it said, thanks to @PGS Murray for the ideas. And I thought that was fantastic because we'd done this right, done a bit of research, and then the outcomes actually now have impacted on our highway code. And I thought there would be no real shift because their publicity is so bad at the Department of Transport. They don't tell anyone, what's in the new highway code. There's no publicity. Yet every day you will see taxis waiting for pedestrians to cross at junctions in a way that you didn't before. You see cars waiting for cyclists who are going straight on. There are a whole lot of changes which have happened to road users' habits that have been impacted by that. So, I feel very proud of that.
And how would you describe the cyclist experience in London now as a cyclist?
I would say it's changed quite a lot in the last few months with electric line bikes and electric hire bikes, really, to a certain extent. I remember Andrew Gilligan, who was Boris's cycling commissioner, would describe cycling in London as feral. And I think that there is something about that, but to a certain extent what we have to look at is how we deliver cycling infrastructure which is for people who don't like being in a feral environment, really.
We like to sort of finish off these episodes with a segment about actionable items. And I want to draw on your experience at Be First a little bit. What are your insights on designing a process in terms of planning and policy making designed for delivery?
Well, I spent 6 years on the board of Be First, which was Barking and Dagenham's regeneration delivery vehicle. There were two very, I'd say, charismatic leaders. The chairman of Be First was Lord Bob Kerslake, who was a fantastic thinker, expert on housing, and the very charismatic leader of Barking and Dagenham at the time, Darren Rodwell. And they were driving this organisation, which was a separate but wholly owned company of Barking and Dagenham, with a very different view of how you deliver stuff than a lot of local authorities that I'm aware of, where the planning department was taken out of the local authority into Be First. The Democratic Planning Committee that still remained where it was, and Caroline Harper, who had been in the more commercial sector, and this collaboration between public and private was something which actually worked very effectively. That Darren Rodwell was very committed to, might say, squeezing the most out of the private sector, but he always with the view that it would be a benefit to the people who delivered for him. And also there was obviously quite a lot of its own housing which required major renewal too. So that was a project in itself. For external developers, basically the view of the planning department was that we have one of the poorest boroughs in London. We have space here. You're welcome to come and develop here, and we welcome you and help you deliver what you need and what we need. And it's a two-way discussion. When Caroline Harper joined, the planning department was, way down in the hundreds of least performing planning departments, and for the last few years they've won most of the awards going, MRTPI awards, planning awards, as the best performing. So they were able to perform well. They delivered permissions in time or refused them in time, but more often than not, people only got to that stage through a discussion, which meant that what they were putting in was fairly positive and likely to go through. So a lot of successes there. I think the whole attitude was so different to what I find in a lot of planning departments, that where stuff which doesn't need to just takes ages and ages. Nobody likes actually accusing planners of being too slow because it might have a kickback. So I can't say what the practice is, but two small infill buildings on a waste site is 3 years in the making. It makes it totally unviable. And I remember a long time ago, actually, because this isn't new, complaining about the length of time things take in planning isn't new. I remember back in the 1980s, there's a chap called Michael Manser, who was the president of the RABA, and Michael Heseltine was then Secretary of State for the Environment, and Michael Manser said to him, look, can't you do something about all this planning? It's taking so long. And so Michael said, yeah, of course I will. He said, just get your members to send in all their complaints and I'll deal with them. Of course, nobody wanted to write in and have their be seen to be complaining to the Secretary of State, because that would be the last probably they'd see of the planners. So to a certain extent, it is quite difficult to get this facts and figures. But all I can say is that team in Barking and Dagenham were brilliant. You might say the progress Be First made stymied somewhat by interest rates and rising costs and all those sort of things which have affected house building in London, or the whole of the country really, but specifically in London. But it is, I think, a very good model organisation.
I was wondering what lessons we might be able to draw from Be First as LPA, because if they have the same structural framework as a poorly performing planning department, what are the specific mechanisms that an LPA can really take on board from Be First's success?
I would say, number one, it's one of attitude, which I think does come from the leadership. And as I say, Bob Kerslake was fantastic, and Darren Rodwell, I'm a great admirer of him, and I was very upset that he didn't become Member of Parliament for Barking and Dagenham, because he would have made a great housing minister and might have had a chance of delivering 1.5 million homes, but which I can't see them doing. But I think leadership, and I was a leader of Hammersmith and Fulham the other day, and Steve Cowan is also rather like Darren Rodwell, very inspiring in the way that he interacts with the academic sector, worked with Imperial College in creating White City into an innovation hub. The work that he did with Fulham Football Ground to create a new big facility there. These are all negotiations with private sector saying, well, if you want this, you give me that. And I think that sort of enthusiasm about how both parties can improve boroughs is very important. But I think that it is that decision that you've got to say, well, if we're going to deliver the housing London needs, we are going to have to work with the private sector. We are also, at the same time, to be making sure that we can deliver more homes ourselves. I think local authorities need to up their game in terms of numbers, and I think Sadiq Khan has been very good at encouraging that, but we need much more.
Agreed.
And if you just look at the stats of housing from the post-war period onwards, nobody has filled that gap left by the getting rid of the public sector delivery in the 80s.
You did listen to our earlier episodes on.
Well, I think these are, hopefully the more people say these things, the more somebody up there will take notice, really, because something needs to happen. And as I was saying, that at NLA we now have Opportunity London as a sort of part of the armoury of things that support planning in London, and that is about local authorities being able to access investment that they wouldn't normally get, or investment they might cycle to MIPIM to get, but now that is something where Opportunity London is putting forward a sort of portfolio of spade-ready projects which investors can get involved with. And I think that those authorities who take that on board really can benefit.
So on the Be First lessons and take-homes, I want to try to boil it down. So we've got attitude, being frank about the big stuff, getting on with the little stuff, and having a funding structure in place to deliver the vision that comes from leadership.
And I think a positive public-private engagement.
Yeah. That's a really good point too. We talk about some of the problems that face the culture in town planning. Can you talk more about the attitude part? Because I think that that's such an interesting key distinction between the Be First model and an unhappy example, wherever it might be. Because the system as it's designed can really be whatever you want to make of it in either of these directions, and with all sorts of variation in between. How do we think more about attitude?
Well, I would say if we're talking about public-private, enthusiasm for that sort of engagement varies from politician to politician and borough to borough. And I would say that one of the big issues of delay, debate, discussion is viability, really. We're getting to a stage where viability becomes so difficult that actually people say, well, I'm going to do something else with my money or go fishing. We have to be aware of that. This is a two-sided game, really, and it's not just delivering for one side or the other. It has to be a partnership, and there ain't that much going to be coming out of government for quite a long time, and so we have to look at other ways of doing it. And I think the state of delivery of housing at the moment is quite dire, really, in terms of what the long-term impact of that of people who won't have anywhere to live. We talk about creating an equitable city. But there is nothing more inequitable than having nowhere to live, really. If you've got nowhere to live, you can't get a job, you can't look after yourself properly. I mean, all those sorts of things that we have to deliver. When we say affordable housing, that all different incomes can actually afford. And social housing is one of the key issues where we need to deliver numbers.
Aaron, I can distill your points even further, like your summary points. What I'm hearing is bold vision and alignment on that vision.
I would add design. And design was really important. And I thought the real sign of that was that when the sort of first phase of Gascoigne was completed, these were public housing projects. You know, there were people knocking on the door wanting to buy them. And we thought a lot at the beginning around how you did deliver affordable housing, i.e. affordable in building it, because you've got to build it to a cost, but it needs to be quality. So White Architecture, who had done some work in UK, but a Swedish company who had really interesting ideas around social housing, and Sweden as a country has a lot of set the pace for quite a lot of that sort of housing too. And
just on Sweden quickly, have you been to Västerhamn in Malmö?
Yes.
Do you love it or do you love it?
Well, I could never understand why they had a big tower with a sort of... That was very incongruous, but I think some of the little terrace housing near the water is just great and really good. And I think also Malmö is really interesting now because Finn Williams, who was the person who set up public practice, having come out of the GLA, he's now there as their city architect.
Really?
And he's transforming the place, transforming attitudes to architecture, transforming attitudes to design. And he says, well, it's not really about having a city architect, it's about having a city of architects. So it's a consultative process where you bring everyone into the process. And that is a clear vision that he has brought to that place and is changing things. It shows, again, the right leadership can transform cities.
That's terrific. Peter Murray, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Peter Murray of New London Architecture. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch, then we'd love to hear from you. Please write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my colleague and co-host Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thank you so much for listening.